Millions of ordinary people walking around today are carrying a hidden inheritance in their blood, a genetic signature from the Viking Age that most of them will never even suspect is there. And for a very long time, the popular story of who the Vikings were and what happened to them was built on a simple, almost cinematic idea. Fierce warriors from the frozen fjords of Scandinavia appeared out of nowhere, burned their way across Europe's coastlines, terrorized kings and monks alike, and then, having made their mark on the history books, they vanished back into the northern mists as though they had never really belonged anywhere else. That tidy narrative made for gripping textbook reading and even better television, but it was never the whole truth. And over roughly the last 10 to 15 years, an explosion of large-scale ancient DNA research has quietly dismantled it piece by piece, revealing that the blood of these seafaring raiders did not disappear at all, but instead spread outward like ink through water, seeping into the populations of Britain, Ireland, France, the Baltic states, deep into Eastern Europe, and even down toward pockets of the Mediterranean world, blending so thoroughly and so seamlessly with local people that within a handful of generations it became almost impossible to see with the naked eye, hidden in plain sight inside the family trees of millions who have no idea it's there. So why, if the genetic evidence is this overwhelming, were generations of students, readers, and museum visitors taught a version of history in which the Vikings were treated as temporary outsiders? A violent weather system that blew through and then cleared rather than a permanent living presence woven into the ancestry of the very nations they supposedly only raided. And once a person actually sits with that genetic evidence, once they understand how deep and how wide this ancestral thread really runs, it becomes very difficult to look at European history the same way again. For generation after generation, the standard telling of the Viking story followed an almost formulaic script. Sudden shocking raids beginning in the closing years of the 8th century, sails appearing on the horizon with no warning, monasteries and coastal towns looted and burned, terrified chroniclers scribbling down accounts of destruction. And then in the telling most people grew up with, a slow fading away as if the raiders simply lost interest and drifted back to wherever they had come from. The reality on the ground was almost nothing like that. Many of the men and women who arrived on those ships never left again. They put down roots in what became England's Danelaw, carving out a distinct cultural and legal territory across the north and east of the country. They founded Dublin, transforming a modest settlement into a thriving trading hub that would shape Irish urban life for centuries. They took control of Normandy in northern France, establishing a ruling dynasty descended from the Norse chieftain Rollo that would, within a few generations, produce the very Normans who crossed the Channel in 1066. They pushed along the great river systems of Eastern Europe, trading, settling, and intermarrying as far as the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphates, following trade corridors that connected the Baltic Sea all the way down to the Black Sea and beyond. Wherever they went in significant numbers, they married local women, raised children, built farms, established towns, and in some cases founded entire ruling dynasties that would go on to shape the politics of medieval Europe for hundreds of years. And yet, when it came time for national histories to be written, this deep genetic blending was almost always reframed as something softer and less threatening, described instead as cultural absorption rather than what it actually was, which was a genuine and lasting mixing of bloodlines. In England, the Norse contribution was folded into a gentler label Anglo-Scandinavian heritage, a phrase that sounds almost bureaucratic compared to what it represents. In France, the Norse settlers who took Normandy and intermarried with the local population were simply rebranded as Normans, their Scandinavian origins gradually smoothed out of the national story. In Ireland, the Norse founders of cities like Dublin, Wexford, and Waterford were slowly absorbed into a broader Gaelic identity, until their foreign origins were treated almost as trivia rather than as a defining feature of Irish urban history. Bit by bit, over the span of centuries, the word Viking itself narrowed in meaning until it referred almost exclusively to the raider, the outsider, the temporary invader, and almost never to the ancestor quietly sitting a few branches back on someone's family tree. Part of the reason this simplification took hold so thoroughly was political rather than purely historical. As European nations began to consolidate stronger, more unified identities during the medieval and early modern periods, there was enormous pressure to emphasize continuity, purity, and an unbroken bloodline stretching back into an idealized past. Foreign blood complicated that story in ways that were politically inconvenient, because admitting outright that invaders had become forefathers meant blurring the comforting, simple line between us and them, between the defenders of the homeland and the people who had once threatened it. It was far easier and far more useful for building a cohesive national myth to describe the Vikings purely as an external threat that had been repelled or endured rather than acknowledging them as genuine contributors to the national gene pool. There is also a more practical, almost accidental reason the story got skewed the way it did. Early historians had to rely almost entirely on written records, and the vast majority of those records were produced by monks and clergy who had experienced Viking raids firsthand, often as victims. Their chronicles understandably emphasized destruction, terror, and loss rather than the quieter, less dramatic reality of intermarriage, land settlement, and gradual cultural blending that was happening alongside the violence. A burned monastery makes for a vivid, quotable line in a chronicle: a Norse farmer quietly marrying a local woman and raising children who spoke both Old Norse and Old English does not. On top of that historical bias, the 19th century brought its own romantic reshaping of the Viking image, particularly within Scandinavia itself, where Vikings were reinvented as heroic explorers, adventurers, and symbols of national pride, a rebranding that fed into the Romantic era's fascination with bold, individualistic heroes. Other nations, meanwhile, tended to keep the Vikings at arm's length in their own national narratives, treating them as fascinating but fundamentally foreign. Colorful characters in someone else's story rather than genuine ancestors in their own. When large-scale genetic studies finally began systematically analyzing ancient Viking-era remains, most researchers actually expected their findings to confirm the traditional picture: a genetically distinct and relatively uniform Scandinavian population that expanded outward for a couple of centuries, and then largely receded back into its homeland. What they found instead was far more complicated and far more interesting. One of the most comprehensive of these studies, published in 2020, examined hundreds of skeletons from Viking-era burial sites scattered across Scandinavia, the British Isles, Eastern Europe, and even as far away as Greenland, with researchers attempting to map out genetic signatures associated with Viking identity, and then compare those signatures against modern populations living in the same regions today. The first major surprise was that the Vikings themselves were never a genetically uniform group to begin with, and even within Scandinavia there was significant internal diversity among the people buried in what were clearly identifiable Viking-era graves. Some individuals interred with full Viking burial customs, weapons, ships, grave goods carried genetic ancestry tracing back to southern Europe, to the Baltic region, and even to parts of Asia, which strongly suggests that Viking identity was never a strictly ethnic category defined by bloodline alone, but was instead, at least in part, a cultural and social identity that outsiders could join, adopt, and travel under. People from very different genetic backgrounds appear to have assimilated into Norse communities, taken on Norse customs, and been buried according to Norse traditions regardless of where their ancestors originally came from. The second and arguably more striking finding was that the genetic footprint left behind by Viking-era expansion runs far deeper into modern populations than almost anyone had anticipated. In parts of England, most notably in Yorkshire and across the Orkney Islands off the northern coast of Scotland, modern DNA sampling revealed substantial ongoing Scandinavian ancestry among the current population, with researchers finding that in some areas as much as a quarter of the male lineage could be traced back to Norse Y chromosome haplogroups commonly identified in confirmed Viking burial sites. Ireland showed remarkably similar patterns, particularly concentrated around coastal cities with clear Norse founding stories, including Dublin and Limerick, both of which trace their urban origins directly back to Norse settlers who arrived by longship centuries ago. Normandy in northern France showed its own distinct Scandinavian genetic traces, entirely consistent with the historical record of the territory granted to the Norse chieftain Rollo and his followers in the early 10th century, a settlement that would eventually produce the Norman dynasty. Perhaps the single most unexpected finding of all came from Eastern Europe, where genetic markers strongly linked to Viking-era Scandinavian populations turned up along ancient trade routes stretching through what is now Russia and Ukraine, regions that once formed the backbone of the Varangian trade networks, the river-based trading and raiding routes used by Norse merchants and warriors who traveled the great rivers connecting the Baltic Sea in the north all the way down to the Black Sea in the south. Taken together, the data painted a picture that directly contradicted the old raid and retreat narrative, suggesting instead that Viking expansion routinely produced genuine long-term settlements, that Norse men frequently married local women wherever they settled, that these mixed communities integrated fully into the surrounding societies over time, and that their descendants simply remained, gradually losing any outward marker of foreignness while quietly carrying that Norse ancestry forward generation after generation. Even more revealing was the discovery that Viking-era expansion followed clear, distinct regional patterns rather than spreading randomly or uniformly. Genetic markers associated specifically with Danish Vikings turned out to be strongest in England, consistent with historical accounts of Danish raiding and settlement concentrated in the eastern and northern parts of the country. Markers associated with Norwegian Vikings appeared more heavily concentrated in Ireland and across parts of Scotland, again matching the historical pattern of Norwegian expansion westward across the North Atlantic. Markers linked to Swedish Vikings, meanwhile, were found predominantly along the eastern trade corridors leading toward the Baltic region and further east still, matching Sweden's historical orientation toward trade and expansion in that direction rather than westward raiding. In the Orkney Islands specifically, researchers discovered that a striking proportion of modern male lineages still carry haplogroup I1, a Y chromosome lineage strongly associated with Scandinavian populations throughout the Viking Age. In parts of northwestern England, certain branches of the R1 haplogroup showed distribution patterns far more consistent with direct Norse settlement during the Viking era than with any later medieval population movement, helping researchers distinguish genuinely Viking-era ancestry from other, more recent sources of genetic mixing. Mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down exclusively along the maternal line, added another crucial layer to the picture by revealing that Viking-era migration was never an exclusively male affair of raiding warriors alone. Women traveled as well, whether as wives brought along on expeditions, as settlers arriving after initial conquest, or through intermarriage with women from the local population. In Iceland in particular, genetic studies have shown a clear pattern of Scandinavian male ancestry blending with Celtic female ancestry, most likely reflecting Norsemen who brought or acquired Gaelic wives from Ireland and Scotland during the early settlement of Iceland, a pattern far more consistent with genuine, lasting settlement than with a simple hit-and-run style of conquest. Over the many centuries that followed, these once distinct Viking genetic markers gradually blended into the broader genetic landscape of Europe as a whole. Languages shifted and evolved, family surnames changed to reflect new local customs, distinct cultures merged into one another, and the outward visible signs of Norse origin slowly faded from view even as the underlying genetic thread persisted quietly beneath the surface. Given how widely this ancestry has spread, a natural question follows. How could someone actually go about telling whether Viking DNA might exist somewhere in their own family history, if a family's roots trace back for many generations into regions with documented Norse settlement? Whether that's northern and eastern England, coastal Ireland, Normandy, the Northern Isles of Scotland, or the river trade routes of Eastern Europe, the statistical probability of carrying at least some Viking-era genetic influence increases significantly, not because every single person living in those regions was of Norse origin, but because intermarriage and gradual cultural integration were so common there over the intervening centuries. Generation after generation, Viking settlers effectively became locals, and at the same time local populations absorbed a small but persistent thread of Norse ancestry into their own bloodlines. Interestingly, certain first names that have been passed down through families for generations, names like Eric, Leif, Gunnar, or Freya, can serve as subtle hints of historical Norse influence, particularly when those names appear alongside a documented geographic connection to a known settlement region. Of course, names shift in popularity, spelling changes over time, and political borders are redrawn again and again, so no single name proves anything on its own. But when these naming patterns cluster together with regional ancestry and other historical evidence, the overall pattern becomes considerably more meaningful. For a great many families, stories of a distant Viking ancestor were long dismissed as nothing more than romantic family legend, embellished over generations around the dinner table. Yet modern DNA testing has, surprisingly often, ended up validating exactly these kinds of old family stories. A relatively modest percentage of Scandinavian ancestry showing up on a DNA test, somewhere in the range of 5, 10, or 15%, does not necessarily point toward a recent immigrant ancestor arriving within the last century or two. It may just as easily reflect a Viking settler from roughly 1,000 years ago whose descendants simply never left the region their ancestor originally settled in. There are also subtler, easily overlooked regional naming traditions that linger beneath the surface of everyday life. In parts of northern England, surviving medieval records show hybrid Anglo-Norse names, combinations of Old English and Old Norse elements that emerged specifically after Viking settlement took hold in those areas. Families who have carried these blended names for centuries may no longer recognize or identify them as having any Scandinavian origin whatsoever, even though the underlying linguistic structure of the name still quietly reflects its Norse roots. Another frequently overlooked clue lies buried in old land records and parish histories. Certain villages founded during the period of the Danelaw retained distinctly Norse place names for centuries after Viking political control of the region had long since ended. And if a family's ancestral village or town happens to carry one of these Norse-derived place names, that can be a meaningful indication that Viking settlers once made up a significant portion of the local population there. There is also the broader matter of long-term migration and occupational patterns within particular family lines. Some family histories reveal repeated patterns of coastal living and movement across generations, fishing communities, shipbuilding trades, and seafaring or trading professions passed down from parent to child. While none of these occupations are uniquely or exclusively Viking in origin, they were deeply and historically embedded in Norse culture and daily life. And when this kind of maritime family pattern intersects with a documented settlement region and supporting genetic evidence, it strengthens the overall case considerably. When all of these different threads intersect and reinforce one another, they suggest that Viking ancestry for a great many modern families is not some distant, exotic curiosity to be mentioned once at a dinner party, but rather a genuinely integrated and meaningful part of that family's lineage stretching back over 1,000 years. Turning to the genetic science itself, in studies of ancient Norse remains, certain Y chromosome haplogroups appear again and again with notable frequency, most prominently haplogroup I1, which is especially common throughout Scandinavia, along with certain branches of haplogroup R1 that are specifically linked to the period of Viking Age expansion across Europe. Because these particular markers are passed down almost unchanged from father to son across many generations, they offer researchers and increasingly ordinary people using consumer DNA testing services a relatively stable genetic thread to follow deep into the past. If a modern DNA test reveals that someone's direct paternal line belongs to one of these haplogroups, and especially if that finding is combined with documented family ancestry tracing back to a known Viking settlement region, it meaningfully strengthens the overall case for genuine Norse ancestry somewhere in that family's history. That said, it is important to be precise, and to avoid overstating what these genetic markers can and cannot actually tell us, because carrying a particular haplogroup does not automatically equal Viking identity in any simple, direct sense. Haplogroup I1, for example, actually predates the Viking Age itself by many thousands of years, having existed in Scandinavia and other parts of Europe long before longships ever set sail on raiding expeditions. What ultimately matters most is not simply the presence of a particular marker in isolation, but rather the specific historical and geographic context in which that marker shows up. When a haplogroup that was common among people buried in confirmed Viking-era graves also shows up at unusually high frequency, in a region that historical records confirm was heavily settled by Norse populations, that convergence of genetic and historical evidence becomes considerably more meaningful and persuasive than either piece of evidence would be entirely on its own. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited exclusively through the maternal line, offers a valuable complementary set of clues on the female side of a family tree. While Viking-era migration and expansion were often led predominantly by men, particularly in the earliest raiding expeditions, women clearly traveled, settled, and intermarried as well, and their genetic contribution shows up clearly in the historical record. In Iceland specifically, as mentioned earlier, genetic research consistently shows Scandinavian male ancestry blending with Celtic female ancestry, a pattern that strongly points toward genuine long-term settlement and family formation rather than a simple temporary pattern of conquest and departure. It's a pattern researchers see repeated in various forms across many of the regions where Norse settlers put down lasting roots. Many people today who trace their family history back through entirely English, Irish, Scottish, or even French family trees, with no documented Norwegian or Danish grandparent anywhere in living memory, are often genuinely surprised to see anywhere from 5 to 20% Scandinavian ancestry appear in their consumer DNA test results. Without any known recent Scandinavian relative in the family, that kind of result can seem puzzling or even like a testing error at first glance, but the explanation usually lies much further back in time than most people initially assume. Because Viking-era settlement happened well over 1,000 years ago in many of these regions, the genetic contribution left behind by those original Norse settlers has become deeply and thoroughly blended into the broader local population over the many centuries since. Across that span of time, surnames changed to reflect new languages and customs, spoken languages evolved and shifted, political borders and national identities were redrawn again and again, Yet the underlying Scandinavian genetic component remained present in the population the entire time, diluted with each passing generation but never fully erased. Another useful layer of evidence for modern genealogists comes from autosomal DNA, the combined genetic material that every person inherits from both parents rather than from a single unbroken paternal or maternal line. While autosomal analysis is generally considered less precise than Y chromosome or mitochondrial testing, when it comes to tracing a single specific ancient lineage back through history, it can still be extremely useful for detecting broader regional patterns of Scandinavian ancestry that appear consistently across multiple different branches of a family tree at once. When that kind of Scandinavian genetic signal shows up consistently across several unrelated branches of the same family, rather than being concentrated in just one narrow line, it often points toward older, more widespread historical integration of Norse ancestry into the wider community, rather than suggesting a single, more recent immigrant ancestor arriving from Scandinavia within the last few generations. It's also worth pausing to note that not all Vikings actually looked the way modern popular culture and stereotype tend to suggest. Both archaeological evidence and genetic evidence together demonstrate that there was considerable physical and genetic diversity among people living during the Viking Age, and the enduringly popular image of the tall, blonde, blue-eyed warrior represents only one part of a much more complicated and varied picture, one that included people with darker hair, different builds, and genetic backgrounds drawn from well beyond Scandinavia's own borders. When genetic markers, documented regional ancestry, and researched family history all converge and point in the same direction, together they form a considerably stronger and more convincing case for Viking ancestry than any single piece of evidence, whether a haplogroup, a surname, or a family legend, could ever manage entirely on its own. In many coastal communities especially, a strong maritime identity runs remarkably deep across the generations, and families with long histories of fishing, shipbuilding, seafaring trade, or naval service may well be reflecting an inherited cultural and genetic connection to the seafaring cultures that once dominated those particular coastlines centuries ago. Not every coastal family with a seafaring tradition is necessarily of Viking descent. Of course, that would be an obvious overstatement. But when a documented maritime family tradition overlaps clearly with a known historical settlement region and is further supported by genetic testing results, it does meaningfully strengthen the overall pattern of evidence pointing toward Norse ancestry. There are also linguistic remnants of Viking settlement that survive quietly in everyday speech to this day. A significant number of words with clear Old Norse origins remain deeply embedded in Northern English dialects that were directly shaped during the centuries of Danelaw settlement. Words so thoroughly absorbed into everyday English that most speakers today have no idea they originally came from Old Norse at all. Even certain distinctive architectural traditions carry traces of this Norse influence, with long, narrow farmhouse designs and particular boat-building techniques found in parts of Britain that closely mirror Scandinavian building and construction methods first introduced to the region roughly 1,000 years ago. Given how genuinely widespread this Viking ancestry turns out to be once researchers actually go looking for it, it raises an obvious and important question. Why was this reality downplayed in mainstream historical education for so many generations? Part of the answer lies in the way nations construct their own founding identities and origin stories. As medieval kingdoms gradually evolved into modern nation-states over the centuries, those emerging states needed clear, coherent origin stories that emphasized unity, continuity, and a sense of being fundamentally distinct from outside groups and outside influences. The Vikings, with their messy, complicated history of both violent raiding and genuine long-term settlement and intermarriage, simply did not fit neatly into that kind of tidy national framework. In English chronicles, they were remembered primarily as invaders. In Christian religious records, they were remembered primarily as pagans, dangerous and spiritually threatening outsiders. In the early national myths of several different European countries, they were remembered primarily as foreign disruptors of an otherwise continuous and orderly national story. In England specifically, Norse settlers were gradually folded into a broader, more unified Anglo-Saxon national identity over the centuries that followed. In France, the Norse settlers who took Normandy eventually became simply Normans, and later still, over further generations, simply French. Their distinctly Scandinavian origins gradually smoothed away almost entirely from the national narrative. In both Ireland and Scotland, deep Norse roots were similarly softened over time into a broader, more generalized sense of local heritage, rather than being acknowledged as a distinct and significant genetic and cultural contribution in their own right. Generation after generation, the word Viking itself came to describe raiders confined safely to the pages of history books, rather than being understood as describing actual grandparents and great-grandparents sitting quietly within people's own family trees. There was also, quite simply, a significant element of national pride at stake in how this history got told and retold. Scandinavian nations themselves generally chose to embrace their Viking heritage openly and proudly, building museums, monuments, and national identity around it. While many other nations that had been on the receiving end of Viking raids and settlement generally preferred, instead, to remember and commemorate their own historical resistance to the Vikings rather than acknowledging the deeper, more complicated reality of genetic and cultural integration that followed. In the end, it was simply easier and more comfortable for many nations to frame the entire Viking Age as one dramatic chapter of conflict and resistance safely contained within the past, rather than acknowledging it honestly as one of the genuine foundational threads woven into their own modern population's ancestry. But the accumulating genetic evidence makes increasingly clear that the Vikings were never merely a passing, temporary footnote scrawled into the margins of European history. They became a permanent, living part of that history, woven directly into the population and the bloodlines of the very nations that once feared their arrival on the horizon. And for a great many families scattered across Britain, Ireland, France, and far beyond, however unaware they may currently be of it, those long-ago Viking settlers did not simply pass through and vanish. They quite literally became part of who those families are today, sitting quietly 1,000 years back in a family tree that never stopped growing.